everyone. Welcome back to Poetry Revival. This is episode 2, How to Read a Poem. My name is AJ. If you have trouble remembering that, just think of Affable Jeweler. That's what they called me when I worked at Paris Jewelers a few years back. This is probably the most important episode of this entire series. This one and the following one. It's one of those episodes where you say, if you learn nothing else about a certain subject, learn this. And I have to say that that's absolutely true with episode 2. This is absolutely what you need to read a poem and to understand it and to learn to appreciate it. Like all things, it will take practice a little bit, but once you learn the skills that I'm going to cover today and in the next episode, you're good to go. And so I hope you find this freeing a little bit for yourself. I would like to dedicate this episode to my dear friend Jeremy Charles Barnhart, who died just a week ago yesterday, on September 24th, 2022. He passed away. It was Jeremy who taught me how to do recordings for this type of thing. He started me off with a podcast that I did for about a year and then gave that up once COVID came. He also taught me how to do graphic design and that type of thing, without which I would not be able to make the slides that I do for this series that I have. I don't know what I would be doing if it weren't for that skill. He taught me a lot of other things too, how to plan shows, how to perform, that kind of thing. And every time I did a performance, he would do the sound system for me. So losing Jeremy is a huge loss. I think it's appropriate for me to dedicate this particular episode to Jeremy, since it is such an important episode. Everyone who is on my channel is going to hear this episode before any of the others, pretty much. And so they'll always hear the name Jeremy Barnhart associated with it. I think that's highly appropriate. And in fact, it's so important that for every episode following this one, I will include the link for this episode in the description for everything else that follows this. That's how important this episode is. And the one following as well. The one following should be part of this episode. But with that part included, it just became so long. I need to ask you all a favor as well. I need to know if you like the slideshow format that I'm doing for this show. I was originally planning on eventually getting camera working here so that you can see my face. I quite enjoy doing the slideshow format. So I'd like to have your opinion on that in the comments, both negative and positive. Is the slideshow format helpful? Do you find it annoying or distracting? Do you find it funny or witty? Anything like that. Whatever you want to comment, I need your comments on that. And also, if you know of other YouTubers who use a similar format, a slideshow type of thing, I'd be very interested in knowing who. I would like to make this series the best I could do. And watching other people's videos, if they do the same type of format, would be very helpful for me. So all of that would be very great if you would include that in the comments. Now, on to this episode, How to Read a Poem. When I'm talking about how to read a poem, I am not talking about voice inflection or tone or anything like that. I am talking about how to read a poem to obtain meaning from it. How to understand what is being said in the poem. That's the topic for this episode today. I find this topic absolutely imperative, so absolutely important, because the skill of reading poetry is not taught in the schools. And even when they say how to read a poem, and they give you instructions on that, they're generally wrong. I'll talk about that more specifically later on. But since the skill of reading a poem is not taught in the schools, people end up not understanding what they read in poems. And since they don't understand what they read in the poems, people assume that they don't like poetry, when actually they haven't really yet experienced it because they have not been given the skills. And I explained in the last episode, in just a theory, why people need to be taught the skill these days that they probably didn't need to be taught a few centuries ago. But now we do need to be. And so I'm going to go on and I'm going to give you a number of skills, total of 5, but there will be 4 of them in this episode. 5 skills in total of how to read a poem. How to read a poem is not taught in schools, but what is taught in schools is how to find literary devices, as though that's the primary focus of reading a poem. And even students are tested on being able to identify similes and rhyme and symbolism and all that kind of stuff. And teachers assume, incorrectly, that if students have found these devices, examples of these devices in a poem, that the students have understood the poem, read it, and understood it, and liked it, or whatever the case may be. It's the wrong assumption, and it's based on fallacious thinking. So we are going to talk about how to read a poem, not for recitation. We're not talking about poems that you already know. We're talking about poems that you are approaching for the first time, whether you're a novice or completely inexperienced or even a well-read poetry lover already. So skill number 1, forget everything you've ever learned about how to read a poem from other teachers. Everything prior to this episode, forget it, get it out of your mind. It doesn't apply. What they normally have you do when they're reading a poem is they have you sit and meditate and look for poetic devices in the poem. Don't do that. You should not put the burden of finding literary devices on yourself when you are approaching a poem for the very first time. Forget them. Read the poem. That's the point of poetry. Once you understand it, then if you want to look for those things, you can. Let me make this very clear to you. You can read a poem without identifying a single literary device and still be able to understand the poem. I will illustrate that later, but before I do that, let me even make it stronger for you. You can lead a long, happy, healthy, and perfectly normal life without ever having identified a single poetic device in any poem at all, ever, during your entire life. Knowing and understanding literary devices, rhythm, meter, stanzas, all that kind of good stuff, learning these things is primarily for the poet to understand, not the reader. Let me say that again. Learning the literary devices, knowing what they are, how to use them, how to identify them, those are skills for the writer of poetry, not for the reader of poetry. Here's an illustration. Understanding the pipes, the wires and studs, the joists, the nails, the screws, the panels of wood, all that kind of stuff that make up a house, that's important for the construction worker to understand. But you don't need to know about any of those things in order to live in a house. The poet is the construction worker of the poem. The reader is the resident. Having said that, it is important to note that, if you don't mind me using another analogy, like an enemy during war, the better you know the enemy, the more successfully you can fight that enemy. Now, I'm not saying that poetry is your enemy. That's not the point I'm trying to make at all. But the point is that any challenge you are approaching and trying to achieve, trying to get success over, you are better prepared and able to have success if you have a better understanding of it. That's like poetry. If you understand the poetic devices, it's good to know. It'll help you to appreciate the poem more the more you know about poetry. But you don't need those to understand the poem. Like the person who lives in a house. It's going to help you to know about the studs and the joists and the gyprock and all that kind of good stuff. The drywall, they say in the United States. It'll help you to know that. If some kid knocks a hole in your wall, I'm not saying that I ever did that. Never. I'm really not. But if some kid were to knock a hole in your wall in the gyprock, in the drywall, it is better for you to know how to repair that on your own rather than having to call in a professional to do it. Same with poetry. The more you know about it, the more you can analyze it, look at it, see how the poet, the construction worker, did his work. Let me give you an example. I'm going to read a poem to you, and it'll be on your screen. I would advise you to pause the video and read it on your own. So I'll put the screen on, and I'm going to stop speaking for a moment and simply let you go ahead and pause the video and read the poem on your own. So pause now. I hope you got through this. I would love to take the time to walk you through this poem a little bit just to show you how the poet E.E. Cummings was able to construct this poem. But what he did really is simply write a very fascinating and simple and beautiful line. The poem reads like this: "Nothing can surpass the mystery of stillness." Now, this is a short poem, but it is dripping with poetic devices, most of which E.E. Cummings, the poet, invented for the benefit of this poem itself. You didn't need to know any of those in order to understand what the line was saying, though. Not one of those things did you need to know to read the poem and say, oh, it says, nothing can surpass the mystery of stillness. I get it, right? That's all it takes. But if you want to analyze what E.E. Cummings did to this line and see how he broke the words apart and see what the alternating uppercase and lowercase letters do and how the 3-line stanzas versus the 1-line stanzas work together. It's amazing what E.E. Cummings actually accomplished in this little tiny poem. But none of that is important for understanding it. That's my point. Let's go on to skill number 2. This is a very simple skill, but it's important. When you're approaching a brand new literary poem, be prepared to read it twice. Be prepared to read it as many as a dozen times, if that's what it takes to understand it. You probably won't have to read it 100 times, but it might take you several times reading it through to really understand it. If you want to disagree with me on that, then I challenge you to read another E.E. Cummings poem called Oh, By the By. You can look it up on the Poetry Foundation. It's another one of my favorite poems, and I think I talked about it in episode 1. So, that's the second skill. Easy peasy. First skill, once again, in 2 parts. A, forget everything that you ever heard about how to read a poem prior to this episode of this podcast. And part B, when you are approaching a brand new poem, do not try to look for poetic devices. Even though other teachers will tell you to do that, even though other writers of poetry textbooks will tell you to do that, I'm telling you they are all wrong. Don't do it when you're first trying to understand a poem. Enjoy the poem. That's skill number 1. Skill number 2, be prepared to read the poem more than once. That's nice and simple. Skill number 3 comes in 2 parts. Part A, in principle, it reads like this: a sentence is still a sentence, even in a poem. Do not think of each line of a poem as a complete thought. A sentence in a poem can start on line 1, go all the way through line 2, and finish on line 3. In case you're interested, that's called enjambment. E-N-J-A-M-B-M-E-N-T. Enjambment. When a sentence covers more than one line of a poem. It doesn't need to be called anything, but scholars and poets like to invent new words for things, and so they call that enjambment. There you have it. I would just call it having a sentence that covers more than one line of a poem. That's what I would call it. So like prose, a line may end with the end of a thought, but it may not as well. So in prose, when you get to the end of a line and there's no period, you keep on going and you don't even think about it. You need to do the same thing with a poem. There is no need to pause at the end of a line of poetry unless you need to stop at the end of poetry. If there's a period at the end of the line, then you stop. That's the end of the thought. But people tend to read a line of poetry, whether it's a complete sentence or not, but they read it as though it were a complete sentence. And they do that pretty consistently, especially when they're new to poetry. And what happens when they do that is they lose the continuity of the thought. And so they don't understand the poem. And they don't understand the poem, therefore they say, poetry's stupid, man. I don't get it at all. Right? I've heard that so many times. There's no reason anybody should come away from reading poetry saying, I hate poems. If a teacher has students who end up saying, I hate poems, it's likely because they haven't really read any. Not really. Now, a couple of theories here. Why do people tend to stop at the end of a line of a poem when they don't do that in a story? I think one possibility is the idea that there's so much white space after each line. And people see that white space, and it's though their mind says, well, it should keep going, so I'll stop there. As though they're reading all the spaces that might follow that line of a poem. I think that that's one habit that we need to get rid of. Another problem that causes us to stop at the end of the line of a poem is that traditionally each line of a poem begins with a capital letter. And we see a capital letter at the beginning of a new word, we think we have ended a sentence. So these both work together against us. So what you need to do is you need to learn that you don't stop at the end of a line of a poem unless there is a reason to. So I'm going to read to you a poem, a very famous poem. I'm sure you've at least heard the opening thought if you haven't heard the entire poem. But I'm going to read it to you the way a novice reader might read it if you were approaching it for the first time. I'll put the poem on the screen so you can read along, but I'll be reading it aloud as though I've never seen this poem before and as though I'm a novice reader. So this is sonnet number 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with the love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Now, having it read that way, you can see why people might be confused by what this poet is trying to say. And it's not because the poet wrote it badly. It's not because poetry is hard to understand. But it's because you were breaking up every sentence simply because there was the end of the line. And that's part of the reason that there's that kind of confusion. What is she saying? Well, I don't know. I don't get it. Now, there are times where you have to pause at the end of the line. There is a certain kind of punctuation. It's called caesura, and this is a good thing to name. It includes punctuation such as a period, an exclamation mark, question mark, a comma, a colon, a semicolon, a dash, and ellipses. Those all indicate that you should pause. They give you reasons to stop. There are also pieces of punctuation that do not mean stop at all. And when you see these, you don't want to stop necessarily. These include a hyphen, quotation marks, apostrophes, and accents, assuming that there are any. With those, you're not pausing. They don't indicate a pause. All the other ones do. And then there are 3 types of punctuation that it's kind of up to the reader whether there should be a pause or not. It all depends on the context and how the reader reads the poem. But those 3 punctuations are brackets, braces, and parentheses. Now, with all that said, there are times when you, as a reader, will want to pause, even if there is no indication. You can't just do it arbitrarily. You have to have a reason for that pause. And it has to be artistic and creative. You can't just pause because you want to pause. That's just as bad as pausing at the end of the line simply because it's the end of the line. You can't do that. So what I suggest that you do is take the poem, get a photocopy of it, perhaps, or copy and paste it out of a website. Poetry Foundation is really good for this. What you do is you put it on a word processing document, print it up, get a nice large font before you print it up, of course. And then once you print it up, put a nice large red mark at the end of each sentence. That will tell you when to pause the end of a thought. And it's nice in red, or hopefully a contrasting color in any event, so that you can see it in advance and know when to stop. That's going to help you keep the continuity going so that you get a thought at a time rather than a fragment. That's one way to do it. I don't think it's the best way. There are people who use it. I think a better idea is to, once again, put the poem onto another piece of paper. And while it's on your computer screen, put each sentence of the poem on a separate line as best as you can. Sometimes sentences are very long and they're going to go onto more than one line. You have to make it visually clear what a sentence is in contrast to what is just a fragment of a sentence. But here's an example. The same poem that I just read is up on the screen for you. And I have broken this up into sentences. And you can see that some of them are longer than others. And I've indented the second and or third line of each sentence if it runs off the first line. Doing this will also help you to see where the sentence ends and where it begins, so you know where to pause and where to emphasize for the end of an idea. Then you read the poem, but you read it with those sentences in your mind. It will sound something like this. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and, if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Okay. So that's more of what you're going to be looking at when you read the poem and you have the sentences intact. And you may notice, when I was reading that poem, there are places where I paused and there was no pause indicated by the poet. The big one that I emphasize is the last 2 words of the poem. I shall love thee better after death. I emphasize that to make sure it's very clear that this is, once we're in heaven, love is going to be perfected, that type of thing. That's up to the reader, and it should be done sparingly, and it must be done with purpose. I'm not doing it to make the thought less clear. I'm doing it in order to make it more clear the way I read the poem, the way I understand it. My interpretation is coming through. So, that's part A of skill number 3. Let's go on to part B. It's very, very closely related, and you'll understand that once you see it. People also pause at the end of the lines because there's rhyme. It's an odd thing for me to notice, but whenever people see a poem that rhymes, they pause with the rhyme. Even if that rhyme is in the middle of the line, it's called internal rhyme. Even in that case, they still pause. In essence, don't emphasize something that emphasizes itself. And rhyme does just that. Rhyme emphasizes itself. So what you need to learn to do is actually underemphasize the rhyme. And that way it will all level out. I'm going to give you another example here. This is the first stanza from The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm going to read it again as though I'm a novice, and I will purposely pause at the end of lines and at the end where there's rhyme. This is what I hear all the time when I have students who read a poem aloud, and I think you'll understand what I mean when I do it. So this is the first stanza of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more." Now, one thing I notice when people emphasize the rhyme in such a fashion, they end up also emphasizing the rhythm of the poem. So it becomes only this and never more, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, like you're riding a horse or something when you're reading. So you want to read the poem and de-emphasize the rhyme. That way the thought continues just as though you had written out the sentences again. Forget the rhyme. They emphasize themselves. We'll hear them. You need to forget them when you're reading. Here's the same stanza again. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more." Now, when I interpret this poem, this is me. You don't have to see it this way. But when I interpret this poem, I think of the speaker of the poem being frightened by the knocking, startled out of almost being asleep, but not quite. That stage between sleep and awake. He's snapped out of that by this knocking, and he's terrified by it. And so he tries to comfort himself. Only this and nothing more. Kind of treating himself like a child. It's like, just chill out, dude. It's cool, right? That's what's happening there as far as I can see. But again, I have de-emphasized the rhyme. And at certain times, I've actually emphasized the word prior to or the word after the rhyme. That's a good technique to use to help you to de-emphasize the rhyme. So that is skill number 3, A and B. Let's do a quick review here. Skill number 1, in 2 parts. A, forget everything that you've ever heard about how to read a poem prior to this episode. And part B, don't bother looking for poetic devices the first time you read a poem. Enjoy the poem. Skill number 2, when you approach a poem for the first time, be prepared to read the poem more than once. Be prepared to read it a dozen times, perhaps. It depends on the length of the poem, the difficulty of the writing, and all kinds of things like that. Skill number 3, also in 2 parts. Don't stop the thought at the end of the line of poem unless you have to, unless you are told to stop at the end of the line of a poem with a period or a comma or some other piece of punctuation that indicates caesura. The only other option for a pause, and this could be anywhere in any line of the poem, pause when you want to emphasize something. You as the reader want to emphasize something for meaning. That's skill number 3, A and B. Skill number 4 is one we will talk about in the next episode. It's a long and arduous skill, not to learn, but to cover, to discuss. And so I'm going to skip that for now. So we're going to go on to skill number 5. 4 for this episode, but 5 in total, of how to read a poem. And to explain this way of reading a poem, I'm going to read a poem. And the poem is called How to Eat a Poem by Eve Miriam, an American poet who lived from 1916 to 1992. How to Eat a Poem. Don't be polite. Bite in. Pick it up with your fingers and lick the juice that may run down your chin. It is ready and ripe now, whenever you are. You do not need a knife or fork or spoon or plate or napkin or tablecloth, for there is no core or stem or rind or pit or seed or skin to throw away. So, how do you read a poem? According to Eve Miriam, you eat it and enjoy every single bit of it. That's how you read a poem. Approach it like it's a delicacy in a great restaurant, like it's your favorite dessert. That's how you read a poem. I'm going to end with another poem that repeats the second skill that we talked about today. The second skill is be prepared to read a poem more than once. This poem emphasizes that same thing. It's called Unfolding Bud by Naoshi Koriyama. This person was born in 1926, and according to my research at the time of recording, it's October 2nd, 1962. By the way, it's my birthday, so you may wish me birthday in the comments if you wish to. I would like to see that. That's pretty cool. According to my research, Naoshi Koriyama is still alive as far as I know. If I am wrong in that, please, I would like to be corrected for the record. So this is Unfolding Bud by Naoshi Koriyama. One is amazed by a water lily bud unfolding with each passing day, taking on a richer color and new dimensions. One is not amazed at first glance by a poem which is tight-closed as a tiny bud. Yet, one is surprised to see the poem gradually unfolding, revealing its rich inner self as one reads it again and over again. So this has been episode 2 of Poetry Revival. Thank you for listening in. I hope you got something important out of it. If you learned something in this episode, please tell me what you learned in the comments. If you have questions about what I've taught, ask those questions in the comments. I'll do my best to respond. I do humbly ask that you share this video with friends, especially those who have some interest in poetry, regardless of how remote that interest might be. This person might be a professional poet, or this person might be a professor of literature. But you can also share it with somebody who is a novice with poetry, somebody who has an interest but not a lot of experience. That would be great for you to share with these people. I also humbly ask that you like this video, and by that I don't mean just saying, gee, I like this video, gosh. I'm saying please click that like button below the video. And like us on Facebook. There's a page dedicated to this channel. I also ask that you subscribe if you have not. And don't forget to click that bell icon so you get notices with every episode and every time I put up new content. This has been AJ with Poetry Revival. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you again in 2 weeks. Until then, enjoy some poetry.